Thank you very much for having me here today. I spoke at one of these conferences, I think 2 years ago, on my other area of research, which is actually moral expansiveness, the psychology of meat eating, ethics, and these sorts of things. So I was sort of surprised when I was asked to talk about happiness at this conference. So it was a nice surprise, and it's also interesting for me because I guess having two areas of interest, I've been trying to find a connection between them, and as you'll see, that's probably still in the future a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing in that space. And I suppose the question is, is it about feeling well and doing well, and what's the connection between these things? Is it one or the other? Do they both come together easily, or is there sometimes a trade-off between these things too, an acceptable trade-off in some way? But to start with, I want to just reflect a little bit on how we think about happiness, and really whether that's helpful in some ways. But I think it's fair to say that in general, we place a lot of emphasis on happiness in our society. We love happiness. It's something which has been focused on, ad nauseum sometimes, about how happy we need to be. We measure this at the country level, which is good because, GDP alone is not the only sort of way to capture well-being. Feeling happy is also a way to capture well-being, but of course this sets up expectations and a kind of ideal world where we're all feeling happier than we are right now. And so some of my work and the work of myself and my colleagues have been looking at, how does this play out for us? Is this a good way to approach happiness? And I think when you consider that this ramping up of the value of happiness has been going on at the same time that we're having an absolute epidemic of mental illness, depression, anxiety are through the roof. They're continuing to go up. There's a number of reasons for this. It could even be just our tolerance for these experiences, and I think that's something to reflect on as well. But it certainly seems as though our focus on happiness isn't the sort of panacea for treating well-being or for helping us to feel better. And in fact, it seems these two things have been going up simultaneously. So this sort of raises a question about how should we pursue happiness? What's the right way to go about finding happiness in life? And I think one very clear recommendation here is don't make happiness a goal. It's quite simply counterproductive, and there's some good research on this, and it's really very simple. It's the way that human goal pursuit works. If you want to achieve a goal in life and you want to move towards it, you assess how you're going along the way, and often that assessment process leads you to feel there's a gap between where you are and where you'd like to be. And of course, if that goal is concrete, like buying a car or something like that, well, that works well because that sort of negative affect, that slight disappointment that you're not where you want to be, feeds into your efforts to achieve that goal. But when that goal is an internal emotional state, and quite frankly, internally we're very ironic creatures, when you set that goal up internally to be happy and then you assess your progress towards this internal goal of happiness, and you feel disappointed about the fact that where you are and where you'd ideally like to be is not the same thing, it tends to push that further away. So very, very simply, making happiness a goal isn't a great thing to do individually. Some of our work has also examined how this plays out in society and how the world we live in might set up this goal for us, a goal that in some ways is kind of inescapable. You can't escape from a society which says, hey, happiness is the thing you need to be. You need to try and achieve more happiness in life. It's very hard to escape from that kind of expectation or pressure, if you like. And some of our work has suggested that setting up these expectations actually has counterproductive effects. It tends to drive the exact opposite of what it's trying to achieve. And so just as an illustration, I want to run through a couple of studies that we've looked at in some of these topics here, and understanding how this might actually play out. And of course we use experimental methods in the lab and try and examine some of these processes and understand the psychological underpinnings of them. In this particular study, we looked at, what is it like to fail in a culture of happiness? And of course, failure is an experience we all have. It's important. It's part of innovation. It's something that you have to go through in life. It's an important thing to do. And yet if you are failing in a context where it says, hey, you should be feeling happy all the time, what happens here? How does it play out? And so we wondered this, and what we wanted to do was create this sort of experience. So we got participants into our lab and we gave them 35 anagrams to solve in 3 minutes. Now, approximately half of those anagrams were actually unsolvable. They didn't know this. The experimenter at the end of this looked a bit surprised and said, "I thought you might have gotten at least a few more, but we'll move on to the next task." We have ethics for this, I just wanted to say. In the no failure condition, they had exactly the same experience. It's just that they were told this would be very hard and you probably won't get very many right. So we changed their expectation. They didn't feel like they'd failed. So we wanted people to have a bit of a failure experience. We debriefed them at the end. But we did this study in 2 different rooms. In one room, it was like this, right? A sort of microcosm of the happiness culture that we're surrounded by on a daily basis. There's books about happiness. There's Choose Happy up on the wall. There's little post-it notes about happiness. There's the RA herself sitting there with her friends looking ecstatic on holiday. The RA said, "Sorry, the computer isn't working in the room I've been testing in, so I'll have to use this room. Don't mind all my things. I've just been studying in here. Have you read any of these books before? My mum got them for me to help me through my honours year, and they've been a huge help. I just think it's so important to stay positive, you know. Getting overwhelmed with stress or sadness is such a waste of time. These books show me how to not let the negativity get the better of me and stay happy." Sort of, conjuring Tony Robbins, if you like. And so people had this experience in either this happy room or they had exactly the same experience, but in a room that had none of this paraphernalia in it. It was just exactly the same room, but we didn't put anything in it. It was plain. So we had people who failed in a happy room, people who didn't fail in the happy room, and people who failed in just a normal room. And so what we then wanted to know is, did people ruminate more? Well, afterwards, we gave them a period of time just to reflect on let their mind wander, and we wanted to ask them, how many times did you have negative thoughts? And then we probed afterwards how many of those negative thoughts were focused on the anagrams. And so we're interested in, how do people reflect on failure when they've had it in the happy room? A lot more. They ruminate a lot more. It's quite a strong effect, in fact. So people worried about the fact they hadn't done as well as they thought they should have in the happy room. They had exactly the same experience in the non-happy room, but they didn't worry about it as much. Why? Because the expectation wasn't there. They should be having positive experiences all the time. Their experience of failure wasn't inconsistent with this sort of microcosm of a cultural standard we managed to create in the lab. So I think that one of the things that that we need to look at in this way is to stop focusing as much on the positivity of positivity, of the positivity of happiness, the value of these things. These seems to be somehow, we've all evolved this emotional spectrum, if you like, and pleasantness and unpleasantness is just one of the dimensions in our capacity to have feelings. So why have we placed this big value on one side of that, on the pleasant experiences, and seen these as somehow conducive to success in life, and we see the negative ones as somehow different? And if we were to put a picture to it, that's how we see the pleasant side of our emotional experiences. It's just fantastic. And which is okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with enjoying happiness. In fact, it's good. It's good to be happy and it's good to enjoy happiness. And this isn't the key problem. I don't think that the fact that we might feel that way about happiness, or even that we might feel happy, is a problem. I think that it's how it plays out on the other side of things. So this is how we see the other side of our emotional spectrum. If we're feeling depressed and sad and anxious, suddenly this has become a problem. Well, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you feeling happy? Maybe you need to go and see a doctor because you've experienced the other 50% of your emotional spectrum that you evolved to experience. Just in the same. Happiness. Since when has happiness saved a life? I mean, really. It's more likely that your experience of anxiety and fear and panic has been what saved you on the way here to keep you away from danger. Happiness is pleasant and positive. Unclear whether or not it's quite so conducive to saving our lives. But yet we see it. We see the value on either side of this spectrum as somehow very, very skewed. And some of our own research in this has actually shown that when we use a daily diary study and ask people, this was in Belgium, over 30 days, how much they felt that they other people around them expected them not to experience depression and anxiety, and then asked them about their depressive symptoms. We found that, in fact, if people had that felt pressure on day one, on the next day they felt more depressed. The more they felt pressure, the social pressure not to have these sorts of experiences in life, that their experiences were somehow like this, on the next day they felt more depressed. And using network analysis, we're able to show that actually that social pressure was central to that array of depressive symptoms. So it's not that depressed people feel that they live in an environment which doesn't sort of fit with them. It's that living in that kind of environment is central to driving the depressive symptoms that they experience. And it also raises the question of, I guess the origin of depression and anxiety and things like this as well. Is it so much that it's driven by biology? Of course it probably is at some level. But there's also this social, cultural aspect to it that we need to start to address, and we very rarely do. Of course, Aldous Huxley imagined a world in which people also lost a sense of value in their negative experiences in life, and he saw this as very dystopian, as a very negative place to be, and didn't end well, and a very inauthentic place to be as well. So I think that this is a nice analogy, this story that Aldous Huxley told of what it might be like to live in a world where we don't value our negative emotions. We lose sight of that. And it's quite easy to see the value of these negative experiences when you ask people, what's your happiest moment in life? What's the thing that is something that made you sincerely and truly happy? And these are the sorts of things that people will refer to. Giving birth to a child, graduating from an important course, or perhaps finding love. But when you break those experiences down to understand what is it that actually drives your happiness in those moments, you wouldn't have any happiness if it wasn't for the pain and failure and loss associated with it. I mean, I don't know personally, but I heard that giving birth involves quite a bit of pain. I certainly know the anxiety I felt when I brought my 2 children home, and just the responsibility that comes with that. But that's part of what that all involves. If you study a course and you were guaranteed to graduate at the end of it and you couldn't possibly fail, what would be the point? Would you feel a sense of, would you even study? Would you feel a sense of achievement at the end? Would anyone congratulate you if you didn't have the possibility of failing that course? If you take that away, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And finding love is part of this as well. It's the more that you love, the more you expose yourself to loss. If you take that loss away, is love as powerful? Maybe it's still a powerful thing, but maybe not as much. So I think it's important to sort of see that there's another side to this in how we sort of experience happiness in life. And to illustrate that, I was in Brisbane in Queensland during the 2011 floods. And it was quite an experience to be a part of. The entire city flooded. But as part of that, there was this outpouring of I guess, prosocial behaviour. Some 150,000 people turned up. Sorry, was it 150 or 55? I might have exaggerated there. Never mind. A lot of people turned up to help up with this clean-up effort. I was driving down the highway towards the Gold Coast on the weekend, and there were just people lined up across the bridges with brooms and spades, catching buses up to Brisbane to clean up. There were so many people cleaning up, it was actually hard. I went to try and help out, and I got a sandwich and a drink and wandered around and couldn't find it. Really hardly found anything to do. There were so many people. I did try. We saw this in New York as well around the time of September 11. Volunteering across the country spiked. A horrible, horrible event. You wouldn't want to wish it on America ever. And yet across the country, people started, an outpouring of prosocial behaviour was experienced. And it wasn't just for crisis-related targets, it was for all sorts of targets. People just wanted to volunteer their time, they wanted to engage in community. So we sort of experimentally examined this in the lab, and we wondered whether even just these mild experiences of pain that people might have could activate this kind of prosocial behaviour we see. And so here we got people to put their hands in buckets of iced water and to do some leg squats together in a group. These are painful experiences. I can tell you, we also had ethics for this. And so people did both of these experiences, and then we asked them, either they did that, or in the non-paying group, they put their hand into non-iced water, or they just balanced on one leg. It wasn't challenging, it wasn't painful. Then we asked people in each of these groups that did this, about groups of 3 to 6 people in each case. How much do you feel a sense of solidarity with other participants? How connected do you feel? How much part of this group do you feel? How much loyalty do you feel? How much trust? And so we found that after sharing the painful experiences, people felt more bonded together. They felt they were more part of a group, having gone through a difficult experience rather than an easy one. We also looked at behaviour, so we used this economic game here where people could choose a number between 1 and 7. Now, if you choose a 7, you can potentially get $7.80, and so can everybody else, and we did pay people. But if somebody in your group chooses a 1 and you chose a 7, you're only going to get 60 cents. The person who chose a 1 will guarantee themselves $4.20 no matter what. So if you don't really trust anybody and you don't want to cooperate, you choose the 1, you get $4.20, you get out of there. If you want to kind of put yourself on the line a little bit, trust with other people and cooperate to try and achieve something better, you choose the 7. But of course there's a risk to that. What we found was that after sharing the painful experiences, people chose higher numbers. They were more likely to cooperate together rather than when they didn't share those sorts of experiences, when they had just the standard. Similar sort of experience, but it wasn't painful. Of course, walking around and putting your hands in ice water and doing leg squats in groups is a bit weird. So we wondered whether or not something a little more mundane, like just eating hot chili, might do the same thing. So we got people to eat hot chilies whole, or to have a butterscotch, and in groups. We found the same thing. Again, people were more cooperative after having shared a difficult, painful experience together than not. Now, this is obviously just very minimal sorts of painful experiences, the sorts of things we might do every day. If you go into Chinatown, you probably have this sort of experience. These are very minimal sorts of painful experiences, but we see this basic psychological effect. And so going through different experiences together is actually something which increases our prosocial behaviour. There are other ways that painful experiences can be valuable as well, and just as a plug, I've written a book on that called The Other Side of Happiness, and there's a bunch of reasons there, including the extent to which these different experiences contribute to our meaning in life and things like this. So there's a range of ways, and I think changing the discussion around our difficult and painful experiences in life, not just the physical ones, but also the emotional ones, and how they can actually contribute to our lives in positive ways is really important. Not only for maybe just understanding how everyday painful experiences can be beneficial for us, but also for people who have to go through things that they don't want to and need a framework for thinking about them differently, not just as a black and white, bad, good kind of way. It's very hard to deal with a painful experience if you see it as simply bad or as needing medication or as a problem. And so finally, I think that the answer to happiness is perhaps that we shouldn't focus on happiness at all. I think we should focus on other things. Happiness tends to come up from behind. When you try and chase it down front on, it tends to run away from you. That's a simple fact. That's the irony of the human mind. So if we want to find happiness, I think we should be focusing on other things. This is one of my PhD students, Brodie, who's currently working on the link between the search for meaning and prosocial behaviour. Prosocial behaviour is costly but rewarding. The very fact that you guys are here indicates you're very interested in this sort of behaviour. It's an important thing to do. But, it can be costly, it can be hard. So, what are the sorts of things that lead people to want to engage in this? And we're examining whether or not, it's people who tend to seek meaning in life versus people who tend to seek happiness. Is it a more eudaimonic approach to life versus the more hedonic approach to life, which leads people to want to engage or see the value or be willing to endure some of the costs that are involved in enacting prosocial behaviour and sometimes confronting some of those costs that it involves? And I suppose also, does living in a culture that overemphasises positivity even undermine the sense of meaning we have in life sometimes too? Is this a way in which our lives become less rather than more meaningful? I think also focusing on virtue. This might be a bit of an old thing in some ways, but values of benevolence are ranked more highly than values of hedonism worldwide. And yet what's interesting is that psychological research and intervention is largely focused on feeling good. So I think, as psychologists, we've been very good at trying to help people improve their hedonic state. But that's not actually what people are most interested in. People are most interested in benevolence. So how do we help people to become more benevolent? What's the psychological factors involved in that? And I think that this tendency to focus on feeling good, it can drive an inward focus. We can become very self-focused. And that's not actually a good way to be happy. It tends to be a very hollow, bottomless kind of pit in there if that's where you're looking for happiness. We need to engage with others. We need to engage with our world. We need to connect with people and things that are meaningful rather than just focus on whether we're feeling good. It's not a very, not a very satisfying life if all that matters in life is whether or not I feel happy today. And I think moral action is motivated sometimes by negative feelings. Sometimes we have to engage with guilt, we have to engage with anger, we have to even upregulate these experiences to engage with action, moral action. So it's not about feeling good. Sometimes these things are in conflict, and sometimes it is important for us to engage with those negative experiences, the negative emotions in life in order to act well. I guess the other question is that we sometimes see empathy as positive, but is it actually a positive emotional state? Empathy is difficult. It costs us a lot. Is this something that is conducive to well-being? I think ultimately yes. Is it something that is hedonically rewarding? Sometimes not. So I guess broadly I'm very interested in this link between feeling well and doing well, and I think that sometimes these things travel together and sometimes they don't. And I think understanding that is very interesting, including how this starts to play out when we expand our moral worlds more and more and more to include non-humans as well as humans. This is I guess what you guys are here for, and something I'm also very interested in as well. And if you're interested, this is I guess a focus in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences now, the Ethics and Wellbeing Hub. We're specifically interested in understanding this question: how is ethics and wellbeing connected? What's the relationship between these things, and how can we better understand that? So thank you very much.
Now we've got a couple of questions here from the audience that we'd like to ask you.
Yep.
So the top-rated question is asking, at a macro or cultural level, are there any nations that, due to cultural differences, have differing approaches to the pursuit of happiness or reflection on failure? And has this been shown to be successful in improving quantitative life satisfaction?
There are. In fact, we published a paper on this because one of the interesting things is that there is a great divide between, and I'm going to use this in a really blunt way, Eastern and Western cultures, okay? And we don't really know what they mean, but broadly, Eastern ways of thinking and Western ways of thinking are sort of a dialectical way of thinking versus, the Western way of approaching problems. And we see that, it's not that people in Eastern cultures report less negative affect. We all experience negative affect at the same rate. In fact, it's more highly reported in those cultures sometimes. But the rates of mental illness are lower, much lower in Eastern cultures and Western cultures. And so it suggests that there are some basic ways of seeing the world that maybe impact on how we respond to our negative emotions. I think that, one of what I've sort of presented here is one of those things, the way we value emotional states. How does that help us respond effectively to negative emotions when we have them? Is it helpful or does it hinder us? There are a range of other things. People, again, the dialectical way of thinking is more it allows contradiction to exist. It sees change. I think these are ways which, if we think about our negative emotions in that kind of way, we can be happy and sad at the same time. Seems ironic in our culture, but that's actually true. Negative emotions change. Today I might be feeling one way, tomorrow another. Of course, in Western ways of thinking, we tend to predict kind of continuity. So there's some very basic differences that can explain that. Again, it was just descriptive at this stage, but I think there's certainly some research out there which suggests that dialectical thinking is quite a positive way of approaching negative emotions, yeah.
So we've got another one here that says, how could EA leverage these prosocial behaviours to increase cohesiveness and satisfaction?
How could EA leverage? Well, that's a bit of a tricky question. I mean, that's more of a political question, isn't it? I think what you're doing here is part of that, right? I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is how many conferences are there on acting well, and how many conferences are there on feeling well? I think there is a massive focus on our internal emotional states and how we can better those in some sort of way. There's a massive self-help literature out there. I mean, how much of the self-help literature is helping us to act well? I think there's some, maybe the book that was up there about animal farming, but how often we buy in these books that suggest we could, how could we act better in the world? We're obviously buying a lot of books on how we can feel better in the world. So I think you're doing it. I think this is part of it, and I think that the fact that this is still a minority conference in terms of the number of conferences on doing well versus feeling well, but I think maybe that's changing. I think there's definitely a shift. So it's interesting, yeah.
We haven't really got much time left. One last thing I would like to add is just, this is a discussion about mental health and well-being, and so it can often be quite a confronting thing to talk about. Do you have any recommendations as to people who may find this sort of stuff confronting, as to like sources they could seek out to seek guidance or help or that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, mental health is obviously a serious issue, and one which is affecting many people these days. So certainly finding help out there. There's lots of help out there. Going through the GP, psychological services are now under Medicare, but just also talking to people, making sure that you're communicating these things, and if there are issues arising, communicate them to friends. I think we don't always do that enough. I think one of the things about placing value on these positive experiences is that we often don't communicate or find it easy to communicate to people about our negative experiences, the fact we're not feeling like maybe we should be or we think we should be. And so communicating to people around you, communicating to health professionals, there are avenues out there, there are helpline numbers, those sorts of things, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob.
No worries.